Good evening.
Good evening, everybody. And we're going to start shortly. We are just admitting everybody into the Zoom chat, and we also want to make people aware, and this will be repeated several times, that this will also be simulcast on my Facebook page, and it will be there for archival purposes. So if you miss anything, or you're bumped off the call, or if you have friends who want to have access to this presentation, it will be there and it will be archived. And we're still admitting people. And this evening, we have a special MC from my office, Susan Ong. So she will begin, and then I will be making some brief statements, and then we will move into the full program.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. Bonsoir tout le monde. La présentation commencera de quelques minutes. The presentation will begin shortly. As Council said, we're just continuing to admit people as they're joining. Good evening, everyone. Bonsoir tout le monde. La présentation commencera dans quelques minutes. The presentation will begin shortly. We're just seeing just a few more people come in. Okay, so thank you for joining us this evening. Merci d'être avec nous ce soir. My name is Susan Ong, and I'm a policy advisor for Councillor Ralston King. Je m'appelle Susan Ong, et je suis agent de politique pour conseiller municipal Ralston King. We're here tonight to discuss the proposal by Manor Park Management for the official plan amendment. We're here tonight from the councillor, Mr. Lily Agrawal, and the team from Foten, who've been retained for the project. Nous sommes ici pour discuter la proposition de Manor Park Management pour une modification du plan officiel. Nous entendons ce soir des conseillers, Monsieur Lily Agrawal, et l'équipe de Foten, les consultants du propriétaire. Tonight is a presentation only. If you have a point of clarification, you can send a message to myself in the chat. The companion meeting for tonight's session is next week, Monday, the 14th of June, which will be a 2-hour question and answer session. At the end of tonight's presentation, you should feel free to direct all questions to info@visionmanorpark.ca. The questions will be then distributed amongst the council's office, the city planner, and the applicant's team. And the high-level themes will be answered first next week, and then questions will also be taken live from the floor. The meeting will also be streamed live to the council's Facebook page, and you can use this to refer back to it during the week if you want to check back at a slide or for something that was said. The presentation will also be up on the Dev Apps page and the Vision Manor Park website. Ce soir, ce sont des présentations seulement. Si vous avez des précisions, vous pouvez m'envoyer un message dans la chat. La réunion de suivi aura lieu la semaine prochaine, le lundi 14 juin, et sera en période de questions et réponses de 2 heures. À la fin de la présentation de ce soir, n'hésitez pas à adresser vos questions par courriel à info@visionmanorpark.ca. Les questions seront réparties entre le bureau des conseillers, l'urbaniste et l'équipe des récurrents, et les questions compliquées seront répondues la semaine prochaine. Les autres questions pourront être prises en direct. La réunion est également diffusée en direct sur la page Facebook des conseillers et vous pouvez l'utiliser comme ressource pour formuler des questions au cours des semaines à venir. La présentation sera également disponible pour ce page DevApps et ce site web de Vision Manor Park. Although the presentations this evening are going to be given in English, the slides are bilingual and residents should feel free to direct their questions in the language of their choice. Les présentations de ce soir seront en anglais, mais les résidents devront se sentir libres de poser les questions dans une langue de leur choix et réponses seront ainsi. Pour rappel, la session de questions et réponses de suivi aura lieu la semaine prochaine, le lundi 14 juin. I'll now turn over to Councillor King for some brief opening remarks.
Thank you, Susan, and hello, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. I'm Ralston King, City Councillor for Rideau Rockcliffe, and your representative at City Hall. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for a presentation concerning the Manor Park Official Plan Amendment. I'm very happy that so many of you have made time to join us this evening. Last week, we held a presentation for tenants who would be directly impacted by any proposed development. This week, we are holding a meeting for the wider Manor Park community. As a consequence, I just want you to note that this meeting is not only being broadcast on Zoom, but it is also available on my Facebook page and will be archived there for your reference. As you know, Manor Park Management has filed an application with the City of Ottawa for an official plan amendment for the lands known as Manor Park Estates and Gardens. An official plan amendment is a formal process that changes a city's official plan. Such changes can be requested by property owners, and this occurred with Manor Park Management. Official plan amendments are important because they are overall processes that let the public know what the city's general land use planning policies are. And they are also designed to link growth with infrastructure, thereby ensuring that future growth is connected to a community's need. It is important to note that such a process allows for strategic land use planning. This process helps community members understand how land may be used in the future and provides residents with an opportunity to provide input. It is a process that helps decide where future services such as roads, water mains, sewers, parks, and other amenities might be built. The process also helps provide a framework for establishing municipal zoning bylaws to set local regulations and standards like the size of lots and heights of buildings. What this official plan amendment process will not do is establish a construction schedule as an example, or provide or outline any detailed specific designs. The idea is the amendment process provides an opportunity for residents to explore and establish the broad directions of the redevelopment of the 35 acres of land that make up the estates. Any changes that are talked about today are proposed, and that's very important to understand. They are subject to change, and the presentation you will receive tonight is based upon an application that is subject to change. I want to emphasize that I have not made any decisions or indicated my support either way for this project, and I will continue to listen to residents. What I will say is, as part of the overall process of the city's new official plan, which is also currently out for consultation, I prefer this type of process, where we speak to residents and ultimately hear your concerns and see those concerns incorporated into feedback in a master planning exercise. This master planning process allows for the consideration of the lands as a whole. It ultimately allows us to ask questions such as, where are we going to put new parks? Does the infrastructure support this many additional people? Do we need more amenity spaces? It allows us to consider the future development in a holistic fashion. Tonight, the city planner is going to give us a high-level overview of how planning works, just a process, and then there will be a longer presentation from the applicant and their team. Tonight, the series of presentations you will see will provide information designed specifically for area residents. Tonight will be designed to provide you with in-depth information from the developer about their proposal. We will follow up next week, Monday, June 14th at 6:30 p.m. with an in-depth community question and answer period where you can draw upon the information that you obtained, that you gleaned in this session, and provide us with more in-depth inquiries, both to my office and also directly to the developer. Where presentations will be in English, please feel free, as Susan has noted, to send through any questions of clarification about this presentation to us by chat on this Zoom call. So this is important. We're not going into a full question and answer session tonight. That will be next week. But if you don't understand elements of what's being discussed tonight, if you need points of clarification, please send that along and we'll seek those clarifications. So because we're not really answering those in-depth questions tonight, please work on those questions, formulate them for next week's meeting, and feel free to start submitting them to us. Susan ultimately will tell you how to reach us. But thank you so much for participating tonight. And I, like the rest of the residents on this call, are looking forward to this presentation. So thank you so much for your presence, and I will turn it back to Susan.
Thank you, Councillor King. I'd like now to invite Mr. Andrew Mcrae, the City Planner, who's going to give an overview of the planning process.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Councillor King, for the introduction. So I'll just wait as the presentation's coming up. Okay, I see it now, so if we can move to my slides. So good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew Mcrae. I'm a planner with the City of Ottawa. More specifically, I'm a planner in Development Review Central, and I'm the file lead on the official plan amendment application that's before this community and the subject of discussion tonight. Many of you have probably already heard from either via email or mail, and I've been receiving lots of comments. I welcome all those comments, and they're all being taken into consideration. If I haven't heard from you, please feel free to email me at andrew.mccrae@ottawa.ca. and I will gladly add you to my notification list so that you can be kept in the loop on the process and milestone steps. Next slide, please. So as the councillor mentioned, I just wanted to highlight some slides here about general planning process and then about the official plan amendment application that's before the community tonight. So one thing I want to direct people to, if you are very interested in planning and how planning works, the city actually puts on courses that are free to members of the public called primers. There's a lot of good information if you want to check out ottawa.ca/primer. And our two main core primers are Primer 1 and Primer 2, which are broken up on this slide. And it's basically a crash course on, planning 101. What is planning? It talks about the Ontario context right down to what we do in the City of Ottawa. And then Primer 2 is more specific to the development review process, which is what we're dealing with tonight in terms of an official plan amendment application. That's an application that comes through the development review process. So if you are interested in planning at large and in general, I do encourage you to check out ottawa.ca/primer. A lot of good information there and very valuable courses that are free to members of the public. Next slides, please. So as the councillor mentioned, tonight we're talking about an official plan amendment application, and really at the high level it stems from land use planning. And land use planning is really about making decisions about how land is to be developed and used, and using policies that will guide physical change and development and growth across the city as a best balance to try to look at competing interests. Next slide, please. So as a city planner, what's my role? What do planners do? There's a lot of things we have to consider, such as facts, data, and most importantly, our own professional judgment to determine what's the best decision for broad public interest. This could be anything from a very site-specific application, like one building, to a very broad application that may cover large parts of the city, like this application, or even larger ones that may include an entire community. But the premise is, what do planners do? When we go through these application processes, we consult with various stakeholders, which would be members of the public, different technical agencies like school boards, conservation authorities, and our own internal staff of different disciplines, such as transportation, engineering, and parks, for example. Depending on the given application, such as the official plan amendment that's before this community, we'll take in and all that information as part of that circulation and review period. We'll summarize and communicate those results. When we're ready to make a decision or a recommendation that will ultimately go to council, you'll see a summary of that consultation process within staff reports. And as the planner, we make recommendations, which in this case, the official plan amendment application will rise to planning committee, who in turn will make a recommendation to council. And ultimately, council will be making the decision on this application that's before the community. So staff will make recommendations on whether it should be approved or refused. Next. What planners won't do as representing the city is, most cases, we won't make the final decision. So like I mentioned with this application, we'll be making our recommendation, but ultimately council will be making the decision. We will not negotiate compromises between opposite interests and different parties. And we also don't make recommendations based on who is for or against the proposal. We have to take all comments into consideration and try to find a balanced approach that represents the best for public interest. We also don't rely specifically on data in making decisions. Planning is very complicated and it's not a science, it's more of an art. And as you'll come to learn if you speak about planning and different planning process, there's a lot of things that are very subjective and require professional judgment. So it is more of an art, it's not an exact science, and we don't rely on specific data to make decisions or recommendations. Next. So the application before the community is for an official plan amendment. So as a starting point, what is an official plan? The official plan is the city's policy document that really guides the future growth of our city. So think of it as, how is the City of Ottawa going to grow and develop over time? It's really a strategic document. It's not a set of rules for a specific development, but more it's a vision for how we want those rules to be achieved. It's also a document that's statutory and is required for the city to have. We legally have to have an official plan in place in order to address matters of provincial interest that are defined by the Planning Act. And when we, as the city, create official plans, like as the councillor said, our official plan is currently under review. That review has to result in something that's consistent with the PPS, which stands for Provincial Policy Statement. So our local level City of Ottawa official plan stems down from direction from the Ontario Planning Act and the Provincial Policy Statement. Next slides. Within an official plan, you'll see goals and policies that are aimed to manage and direct things like physical change. So land use designations, development of land, protections of natural areas, for example. And it'll also have policies that look at the effects of social, economic, built, and the natural environment. And as mentioned, we do have to be consistent with provincial policy statement, which is why in some cases you'll see different thresholds for where to direct growth, and other measures and protection for informing how members of the public will be participating in different application processes, like the official plan amendment. Next. So just quickly, as I mentioned, development applications, we are in the category of an official plan amendment. So ultimately the application that's before this community will rise to council. Council will make a decision on this. If you are on my notification list, as I mentioned, you'll be notified of milestone periods in this application process. So when the application is scheduled for planning committee, which there is no dates set at this point, you'll be notified of that meeting so that you can participate in that process as well. Next. And lastly, just quickly on process. So an official plan amendment is really an application that's looking to permit development of land in a matter that is different than the official plan policies. So in this case, the Manor Park OPA is really looking at policies to change the permitted building heights across these lands. It's a significant request in terms of applications. We receive about less than 20 of these a year compared to other applications like site plan, where we receive hundreds a year. There's a process during pre-consultation where the developer and the community will come in and say, we have an idea for an application, and staff will confirm what plans and studies are required in order to review that application and go through public consultation. City Council has the authority for approval, and we are currently active in this application process right now in the middle of that process, and it won't go forward to planning committee until the applicant reviews all the comments and says to the city that we're ready to proceed. Can you make a decision on our application? And I think that's it. If you don't want to go to the next slides, I just have my contact information there. And on next week on the 14th for the question period, my colleague Jean-Charles Renaud will be joining me for any questions in French. So thank you. And if you haven't reached out to me to submit comments, please do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Merci pour votre présentation. Je donne maintenant la parole à Monsieur Lalit Agarwal. Now I'll invite Mr. Agarwal to give some remarks about the overarching vision for the project.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks for joining us this evening. It's great to see such a large turnout and so many familiar faces. For those that I haven't met, welcome. Believe it or not, we've been your neighbors for 32 years. We're here tonight to present our initial plans for our lands in Manor Park. Why now? We actually started thinking about the future of Manor Park about 15 years ago. And before proceeding on the initial work, it took us about 10 years to come up with our philosophical starting point of enhancement over displacement. From there, and looking forward to a new official plan for Ottawa and the infrastructure planning that will come from it, we felt that it was the right time to consider our aging housing stock. Work to that effect began in 2016 through a studio at Carleton's Israeli School of Architecture, and it's taken us 5 years to get to tonight. Before handing the mic to Jacob to present our initial plans, I'd like to make 2 points. First, and this goes back to our philosophical starting point, is that we are anti-displacement. Second, we want and we need your ideas. Some of the best ideas to date have come from you and have already shaped the plans and will shape Manor Park. Next slide, Jacob. On the topic of displacement, there will be no demevictions in Manor Park Estates or Manor Gardens. We hosted a meeting last week purposely for our residents first to let them know that if these plans move forward, we'll provide at least a 3-year heads up to discuss our phasing. If we did need to rehouse some of our residents, it will be in a similar unit or better at their current rent or less. We also committed to covering all moving expenses and to, if desired, accommodate different locations and unit types. How is this even possible? Well, since this project will be built over dozens of phases and over many decades, normal attrition and the first phases will create the necessary capacity to allow for every single one of our residents to remain in Manor Park Estates and Manor Gardens. Second, on the topic of engagement, this sort of master planning, Jacob, maybe the next slide. This sort of master planning we're working on is a challenge during the most benign of times, but we're big tent people and have spoken with, in addition to countless residents, sustainable design leaders, school boards, civil engineers, all levels of government, including the NCC, health officials to talk about 880 neighborhoods, potential programming partners, transit visionaries, local retailers, and leading architects. We'd like to hear from you too. People are excited and the feedback has been excellent, but there's still much work for us to do. For instance, there are outstanding questions about amenities, traffic, and built form. As the councillor mentioned, these initial plans will evolve, and it's never too late to share your vision with us. Thanks again for being here tonight. And with that, I'll hand it over to Susan to introduce Jacob.
Thank you, Lalit. I'll now turn over to Jacob Bolduc from Foten, who will be giving the presentation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jacob Bolduc. I'm a senior planner with Foten Planning and Design right here in Ottawa. I'll be walking you through a quick 30-minute presentation looking at all the work that's been completed over the last 2 or so years as we've been preparing the application package. So we are going to walk step by step through the presentation as outlined on this slide. I also want to take the opportunity to say that while the presentation will be in English, some of the slides are as well in French, and myself and a few others from the project team are available to take questions in French next week as well. Alors, j'aimerais juste vous dire que la présentation ce soir sera en anglais, mais moi-même et certains d'autres membres de notre équipe sont capables de prendre des questions en français la semaine prochaine. So to start, I do want to take you back to the first steps, quite literally our first steps. The first steps in any good planning process is to get out there and put boots on the ground and to basically collect an inventory of the existing conditions, the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, the constraints. Just walk around and notice and see what you can see. So we walked around the north and the south portions of the project to get the lay of the land and to document what we could see. Some things that we identified, for example, on the left, some grade changes that might be very nice from a landscape architecture perspective, but pose some accessibility issues. That's one of the things we identified. We also looked at these large mature trees and noted that because they're on an edge condition closer to the street, they would be far easier to maintain as part of redevelopment. So definitely some opportunities there. We also looked at connections to the NCC pathway. We looked at bus stops and street side parking. We also walked through the developments that exist themselves, where people park, where people play. And finally, we sat down and said, okay, if this is going to change, what is it going to look like and where do we start? And so we started by putting a team together. We looked at a range of studies that were prepared in order to inform and support the master plan. That includes transportation for impacts on traffic and transit, as well as the pedestrian realm, cultural heritage for existing heritage resources such as the cemetery, environmental for soils and trees, civil engineering for servicing and drainage. And all of these studies are posted on the City of Ottawa's DevApps page for the general public to look at and review and provide us with your feedback. So the very first step was to get out there and take a look. Second step was to put together a team and get together. And then we started building some ideas. Just to run you briefly through the development process, while Andrew touched on it, we are at the official plan level. And what that means is that this is not expected to be completed until likely 2022. And as part of that 3-year heads up that Lalit had talked about, there's a lot of work to be done at that stage as well, a lot of more detailed work. So at official plan amendment level, you're looking at a very high level conceptual master planning type framework that looks at land use and parks and transportation and infrastructure, building heights, very high level stuff that then eventually gets condensed through a zoning bylaw amendment, a little bit more detailed, site plan control, very detailed, and eventually construction. So at this point, we don't estimate that the first block would be shovel in the ground until circa 2024 to 2026. It is important to note as well that the zoning bylaw amendment and site plan control applications can be processed concurrently. But in this case, we are at the official plan amendment stage, and we're looking forward to your feedback as we move through this process. So once we sat down as a team and we got some of our studies ready and we kept having more meetings, we developed a vision and principles. So our goal is to rebuild an aging housing stock in the face of infrastructure and affordability challenges without displacing a single person. And overall, what we kept seeing as we completed our SWOT analysis and our background review is that there's a lot of opportunity here for new development that can bring together the existing community and ensure that it is respectful and compatible with what the identity of Manor Park is today. So these are the primary principles that we had discussed, and I'll walk you through them one by one. The first being affordable housing. Housing is a continuum and we want to be a part of it, adding a mix of affordable and market housing, various dwelling types, opportunities to partner with community programs and other stakeholders. This is the CMHC housing continuum, and you can see that there's a lot of different housing types that make up a neighborhood, from houselessness or homelessness to social housing, affordable rentals, and finally the market that is out there. We also have community and remembrance. So we looked for symbols that stood out to us and reminded us of the history and legacy of Manor Park. Something as simple as a school that was part of the original plan, or even the old Dairy Queen site that reminds us of the post-war history of the community. We wanted to preserve the street network and the features as much as possible and find ways to enhance them at the same time. We also wanted to take a look at how people move through space through mobility and ease of movement. So whether it's by walking, cycling, transit, automobile, innovative concepts like Woonerfs, which are kind of a hybrid pedestrian road concept, you'll see it below, allows us to make spaces flexible and fluid, which keeps communities creative and adaptive to meet the growing needs. This is a long-term plan. This is a long-term vision. And we want to make sure that that is built into the plan so that the community can adjust and adapt and grow along with the rest of the city. We also looked at connectivity and safety. So building on the last theme, we wanted to identify the relationship between the subject lands and any abutting lands, such as opportunities to integrate with the aviation parkway and improve on existing connections. The goal is to create a network of spaces, public and private, that keeps our community moving and safe. The MPCA actually carried out safety audits as well, and we're working with the NCC to make these connections safer as part of our master plan. The next theme is sustainability. We wanted to build on the existing greenery and landscaping in Manor Park, including the existing mature trees that line so many of these beautiful streets. But sustainability also means knowing when older, more challenging buildings need to be replaced with a more modern, efficient housing stock and more modern and efficient servicing and infrastructure as well. And finally, we also wanted to make sure that our existing neighbors were respected in terms of built form and scale. So while developing a master plan, it's crucial to look at the existing context and weigh it against the planned context. It means locating the greatest building heights away from the most sensitive uses, and it means redistributing density for a more efficient and compatible built form within and adjacent to existing stable areas. The next step is our background review that we had completed to inform our planning rationale and master plan document. Sorry. So we started with a brief overview of the history of the site. I won't go through it in detail, but if you're interested, I would encourage you to go check out the master plan document that is posted on DevApps. So this is an image showing the original plan. It showed 2 future shopping areas at the corner of Blasdell and Saint Laurent. A few things have changed and a few things stayed the same, including a school and recreational area, which you would identify as the Manor Park School today. You'll also notice that the block layout and a lot of the building layouts in terms of the existing project are relatively the same. And so there hasn't been a lot of change with respect to these lands, but as part of the master plan, we can hope and find a solution that is both respectful of the original plan and the existing community, as well as something that helps push this community forward. So we also took a look at the existing roads and street network as presented in the official plan and the transportation master plan. You'll note here that Saint Laurent and Hemlock are both identified as arterial roads, but the portion of Saint Laurent north of Hemlock becomes a collector. This is all discussed through the transportation infrastructure master plan as well as the official plan. Basically just a road classification that shows you the hierarchy of streets in the neighborhood. With an increase in the amount of units, residents and services, good transit support is also required. So we looked at existing transit infrastructure, including transit priority corridors and of course the new LRT network. So as densities increase and change over time, the city will look to improve its transit infrastructure, including lay-by lanes, larger bus stops and pads. There's a lot that we can do together in order to improve our transit connectivity in this neighborhood and to other parts of the city. This is an example of the bus routes as they are, but of course this changes yearly or seasonally depending on the context, and we would anticipate that once this development would be fully realized over the full length of its cycle, that it's going to look quite different. Building on transit, we also looked at employment and how the area is serviced and connected to various employment hubs. That includes Montfort Hospital, the RCMP, various businesses located along the Montreal Street corridor, highlighted in orange, as well as the various industrial areas to the south, closer to the train yards. And our landscape architecture team also prepared a parks inventory. This was a detailed analysis that cataloged and analyzed all parks in the surrounding area by their amenities. Could be soccer fields, playgrounds, tobogganing hills, so that we could build an understanding of what's missing in each of these 2 communities, because we are treating them as one master plan. We are treating them as one community from a planning perspective, but from an inventory analysis or a SWOT analysis or any type of existing conditions analysis of what's there, we can see that there are some differences between the 2 in terms of what exists and what they might need. At the end of the process, at the end of the background analysis, we did prepare opportunities and constraints maps for both the north and south lands. These identify potential pedestrian connections, new gateway or landmark features, walking distance to amenities and other features, signalized intersections, all the things that we need to know before we sit down and actually start putting pen to paper in developing a master plan. So we have the north, and then this is the south, similar in discussing that connectivity to the NCC Aviation Parkway, signalized intersections, walking distance, and of course the lands themselves and any other opportunities that may exist. Now I'm going to walk you through the master plan itself. So this slide shows the north and south lands that are both identified in pink, but there's also several other key elements in the surrounding area that I want to note. It includes areas that might see some transition over the coming years, including lands on Montreal Road and Saint Laurent. We've also identified areas that are less likely to change and will more likely remain stable. Those areas are highlighted in dark gray. We identified the institutions, schools, churches, cemeteries, and other assets that help ground our communities. We also integrated the transit and parks analysis we just discussed. So this helps us see where we might need to introduce some more green space, for example. We note that there are parks up in the north, but there seems to be a distinct lack of green space in the south, for example. So we start with broader land use maps that help show the location, type of development, intensity of use, and these other broader features. So low-rise residential in yellow, for example, mid-rise in orange, mixed-use development with retail at grade in red, private amenity spaces in purple. This map is basically the baseline that we use to develop our more refined concept plan. By acknowledging the different features that need to be present and what they might look like and what type of connections we might see, where a new park is proposed, for example, and we develop a plan that would look something like this. So to point out some of the more important features, you'll note that there is a historical local street pattern that we are looking to maintain as much as possible, but we do introduce some new streets in key areas in order to help break up the block pattern into more manageable blocks that are easier to work with for the purposes of development and traffic management. We protect existing trees, for example, that we highlighted here. I remember on our site visit, we were standing over here looking west along Glasgow, and we said, you know, that's really nice. Is there something we can do with that? And that includes a positive transition between the school site and the park, mid-rise buildings to help frame the park. We also noted existing mature trees along Hemlock that are an existing asset to protect. A gateway building could be located at this key intersection as it is located away from most sensitive uses, but is also highlighted by a major section in this community. We've removed most of the surface parking in favor of some limited street parking. Amenity spaces are focused for residents. We have through these interior courtyard blocks that sort of mimic what exists today, those green spaces that I had seen on some slides, but in this case, there's opportunities to program them or to have the residents come together and see what they would like to see. We had one resident last week talk about gardens, for example. She was saying, I really want to see some gardens. I'm a big gardener and I want to make sure that that is available to me. I don't see why garden beds couldn't be set up in those areas for the residents, as an example. Finally, going back to the original plan, we had noted, and of course, it's just an inspiration. We're not directly looking to revive the plan from 1946, but you do want to take inspiration from it and some of the ideals or some of the vision that they had at the time and see if they can make it work, especially when you're utilizing that existing street network and preserving some of those existing features. So this block here and this block here were actually originally identified as a shopping area. That was moved down here, but we'd like to bring back this intersection as a bit of a community core, drawing on the principles of the 15-minute community in the new official plan, so that it's local commercial, it's service commercial, it's intended to be for the residents of the area, not big regional commercial where people are going to drive from all around Ottawa to come in here. The idea is to bring these services a little more north, more central to the community, so that people who are walking or cycling can more easily access those amenities and create a little bit of a hub, a little bit of a commercial core within the community. So for the south, we did something very similar. Again, land use plan, identify your public park. Something a little different here is we were approached early on and asked about opportunities to work with different community groups on perhaps some local institutional uses, perhaps whether it's youth groups or basic community center type functions. And that could include, for example, a community garden and the ground floor of this building operating as a sort of community center with local stakeholders. Low-rise housing, mid-rise, high-rise with retail at grade, essentially a similar plan to what I just described for the north. And that came to provide our concept plan for the south. In this case, you'll see a lot of similar features. So the greatest heights and density are located in proximity to transit priority corridors. So that's Hemlock and Saint Laurent. For this building over here, it also provides an opportunity for gateway or landmark buildings. There is a sensitive transition to the existing low rise to the north that can be achieved through a different built form, whether that's through townhouses like something like this or through a buffer with a community garden. Part of the plan is also to bring a brand new park to this area, as highlighted here. It's strategically located, again, to provide transition to that existing low-rise community to the north. And that may involve a land swap or other discussions with the municipality in order to decommission Carpenter Way, which currently circles this block here. But rather than having two individual blocks, it may function better to close it and have parking around the back. So support those park facilities. Brittany Drive at the moment is a local road as identified in the official plan and the transportation master plan, but it does connect two different arterials. And so we are looking to recognize Brittany Drive as a collector road with existing transit services because it does essentially function in a similar role to that. More transition to the existing stable low-rise communities that we have discussed, those gray buildings in the first slide that I showed you for the master plan. Greatest heights are generally located in proximity to transit priority corridors, which are exactly what they sound like. They're high traffic movers. For example, Saint Laurent would take you right down to the Saint Laurent LRT station, and that is certainly an asset within the community. There's variation in the heights to provide for a more. Sorry, Susan.
Sorry, it's Susan. There had been a question about private use. Can you expand on that a little bit more, just in the presentation?
Sorry, private use?
Yes. They were asking about private amenities. You mentioned that a few slides back.
Yes. So when you see this pink space in here, and the north shows it maybe a little bit better, all of these pink spaces in here are noted for amenities. So as part of any development, you are required to provide amenity space for your residents, whether that's in the form of balconies or amenity spaces interior to the building or outdoor amenity space. So we didn't put it in green because we didn't want to confuse it with the existing parks that we had. We highlighted in pink here, but that's basically open space that is available for those residents. That is, it's private space for those buildings that surround it. And that the programming or the use of those lands can be coordinated based on phasing or who ends up occupying or running these buildings. So the idea is that that space is private to the development, but there are connections that would pass generally through them. You can see there's a bit of a path here that would allow, for example, someone living here to pass through and get to Saint Laurent just that much quicker. So connectivity and safety is a big point too, because when you have these pathways moving through an existing community, through amenity areas, there are people present, there are windows, there's eyes on the street, and it makes things a lot safer. Again, going back to the principle of community and safety. So does that clear up the idea of amenity space?
We're having a question actually from the floor about what amenity space means. Okay.
So when you have a new development, you are required to provide amenity space, and it can mean different things. So balconies, for example, count as amenity space. That's outdoor private amenity space for that unit. But if you were to have, say, terraced gardens as part of your property for the enjoyment of your residents or your tenants, that would also count towards your minimum amenity space requirements under the zoning bylaws. So it could be gardens, it could be, if for example, you had a tennis court on your apartment complex, then that would be considered amenity space. So it's a fairly broad definition. It's space that can be used by the residents, whether it's private or common, sometimes located outdoors in the forms of balconies or gardens, or indoors. It could be an indoor movie theater. It could be any number of value added facilities for existing residents or tenants.
And do we know how large the parks are, or can we defer that for a question for next week?
We do have the parks. This one here, for example, is about 7,000, a little over 7,000 square meters. And if I have the details on the other one, this one is a little bit larger at 9,200 square meters. And we can have all those details for the Q&A next week. But the intent is to meet our parkland dedication requirements. So we have engaged in those discussions with the city in order to ensure that we are providing a sufficient or more than sufficient amount of park space for this community, as well as ensuring that they are properly located and positioned to best be used by residents. So, for example, on this slide, we had some discussions with the city about where it should go. We identified this part because it is closer to the middle of Brittany, rather than being located on either end, which would make it a lot more difficult for residents down here to go all the way up. We felt this was a little bit more central while still using transition and still finding a solution that uses our existing block layout.
Thanks. I think that's all the questions.
Okay. So when you're completing a master plan like this, there is a discussion that we've engaged with the city. It is required as part of your official plan amendment is phasing. It's not all going to happen at once. This is a decades-long project. So it's still very early in the process to talk about phasing and exactly what's going to happen. But I did want to walk you through a little bit, a few of our ideas to show you loosely how the phases and blocks may end up being developed or played out. But again, there's no timeline for the full development of this project at this time. We anticipate decades, up to 50 years. So when we're looking at a block plan like this, and we've simply just highlighted them in different colors, in this instance, the idea is just to say, well, you know, this street network here, for example, creates a fairly natural block. So we can work with that and use that. Perhaps it's split into two phases, but it seems like a fairly natural grouping. Whereas a condition like this in here, through that background review that we did with our engineers, we identified that there is a fairly steep slope that runs roughly along this line to the tune of about 2 or 3 meters. That's something that affects both of these blocks in a different way, and perhaps that is the delineating feature, for example. So what that looks like is a little bit like this. Whether we're looking at transition to the existing low-rise community to the north through the form of a different built form, could be townhouses, stacked townhouses, but something a little more low-rise, under 4 stories, to ensure that that transition is appropriate and compatible with the existing community. Servicing, so we had our civil engineers out there and they identified a few things that we certainly need to consider when we're proposing our phasing. If there's older servicing in this area that needs to be upgraded, perhaps we start those first phases somewhere else where the servicing is a little more easier or capable of accommodating us, whether it's more efficient or newer. Just perhaps a better idea to go with where that capacity exists to start with. Grading, as I just touched on, is a bit of an issue in different parts of the master plan. But this was one of those lines that we had kind of drawn and said that'll be a challenge. For example, that 2 or 3 meter grade change, you could use it for entering right into an underground parking garage, because most of the parking as part of this development is going to be located underground to free up that space for parks and green space and amenities. We looked at, for example, the school. And I know Lalit and I did have a discussion with the school board earlier this year to sort of touch on, you know, how the project is proceeding and how it's going. And of course, one of the questions was, well, when you get time to construction, that's going to impact us, and how is that going to impact us, and how can we work with you to make sure that the impacts are limited, if at all. So school buses and construction phasing, that's something that we need to talk about when we get into phasing considerations. I touched a little bit about the block layout. Some of them feel a little more natural than others. And in this case, we introduced a new street as part of the street network to help break up that block, make them a little bit more manageable, a little bit more walkable. And of course, traffic is another concern. We hear a lot about the existing traffic at Saint Laurent Hemlock, and that's something we are mindful of when coming up with this plan. And finally, there's the market. I talked a lot about the commercial component that we're looking to include up at this intersection, but that will depend on uptake. If we have businesses that are eager to come in, then that's great. If not, then we might have to change gears and focus more on the residential, but the idea would be to bring a commercial component to that area. And then in the south, we have similar issues. Grading, transit's another one as well. Again, Saint Laurent being a transit priority corridor along with Hemlock. Transition to the existing low-rise community, something we discussed up here. Changing street network, again with Carpenter's Way perhaps becoming part of the park. And what it means at the end of the day is we've identified in red here our potential phase one. And I say potential because there's, again, a lot of discussion and a lot of feedback that we're looking to receive. But the intent as part of that is to reduce the impacts on existing tenants. And we had a long discussion about this with the residents last week about where and why and how. And part of the reason this phase one has been identified is because we, based on our preliminary plans, could remove approximately 10 townhouses and build a building. Those 10 units can be reaccommodated within the existing stock in this community. So those people can be rehoused within the community, as Lalit said, at the cost of the developer in a similar comparable unit with a similar rent. And so the idea would be to displace the fewest amount of people, to rehouse the fewest amount of people while building capacity for future phases. So once we have that phase one up and going, then we can help people rehouse to those who wish to stay in the community, those who wish to remain part of this Manor Park community can be located into that phase one, which opens up possibilities for phase two. And the phasing is going to change depending on north and south. So it's not like the whole south is going to be developed before the north and vice versa. It's going to be a project that is looked at comprehensively and holistically so that we can move forward in a way that is best for everybody. I also just wanted to run through a bit of a project overview, some of the stats that we were looking at. So there's currently 652 units. The estimate that we have at the moment as part of our master plan is 4,000 proposed units. That is required in order to complete our servicing and traffic estimates. So that is simply saying we have this much area, average unit size of this, average efficiency, hallways, and that kind of stuff per building. And this is the number we have. The big reason we do that exercise from a high conceptual level is so that when our engineers get in there and start running the numbers from a servicing and traffic perspective, we can see what works and what doesn't. So that's the existing concept. That's simply for the purpose of running the numbers. But that number of proposed units will certainly change as we become more refined throughout the project. So while we have, for example, existing townhouses, we are looking to propose a variety of dwelling and land use types. So apartments, 1, 2, 3+ bedrooms, townhouses, there's opportunities for retirement home, commercial units, other community amenities like we had talked about, perhaps a community garden or a community center located in the ground floor of one of the buildings. Through an exercise that we completed, we looked at existing footprints and surface parking to calculate how much hard surface is in the area. The existing is about 35,000. And so we have a 4.1% decrease, despite the fact that we have many more buildings and many more units. The amount of asphalt and concrete at a surface level is actually reduced by about 4%. A big way of doing that is by reducing the amount of surface parking, which occupies a fair amount of the site at this time. So it's a reduction of about 88%. We're also looking at opportunities for, like I said, ground floor commercial uses at strategic locations in support of that idea of the 15-minute community. And finally, you'll see that there is an increase in the amount of parks and green space. So 100% new park space that we are proposing at this time, circa 16,000 square meters, as well as courtyard amenity space, which we had a little bit of a discussion about some time ago. And that is a large amount increase over the existing courtyard amenity space. So to put it into a very simple chart, it means that there is an increase in parks, an increase in green space and amenity space, an increase in the number of dwelling units, dwelling types, and commercial units. But there is a decrease in the amount of surface parking and hard surfaces, and of course, a decrease in the walking distance to commercial uses and other amenities. So at the end of the day, this is what it looks like now. This is what we've proposed in our concept plan, including, for example, a new park that replaces a large amount of surface parking here, breaking up the block so that there is a more walkable, a more pedestrian-friendly neighborhood. The amenity spaces are consolidated rather than have these sort of green islands. You'll notice that they are located in the center in order to support and provide better programming or more opportunity for programming just by being better organized spaces. So that's a little bit of an overview, just using this particular block as an example.
Jacob, while we're at that slide, we got a question, a point of clarification about what constitutes a gateway building.
Yep. Gateway buildings are identified in the, I believe, well, they're defined generally in the official plan and I believe the urban design guidelines as buildings that are located at strategic locations that help form a gateway to enter into that community. They're essentially a signal or a beacon that says you're entering here, you are being welcomed here. They take different forms. Similar to landmark buildings tend to identify a location. For example, the tall buildings that are going up around the Preston Carling area, some of those have been identified as landmarks to say if you're walking around, there I am, there's the transit station. Whereas gateway buildings are a little bit different, but they are more symbols that you are entering a community. They tend to have a high level of architectural detail and be generally nicer than maybe some background buildings, but they are generally strategically located as you enter a community. So with that, sorry, if there's no other clarifications, and we can get to those if anybody has any, but to fill you in on the next steps. So to go back to this slide again, we're just at the official plan amendment stage. Please, we really appreciate your feedback and we appreciate your attendance here tonight. We look forward to discussing with you next week in the Q&A session. But we're just here. There's still a lot of work to be done, a lot of detail yet to be resolved. So next week on June 14th is the public meeting, the Q&A session. We encourage you to review the project website. Please feel free to send us our feedback to info@visionmanorpark.ca. That's the project website. And think about the different themes that you want to explore as part of that Q&A session. So parks, parking, transit, schools, shopping, anything you can name. So thank you once again. I really appreciate you coming tonight. If you have any questions, please send them our way and we'll be happy to discuss with you next week.
Merci Jacob pour la présentation. Je vais maintenant céder la parole au conseiller King pour faire quelques déclarations de closure. I'll now turn over to Councillor King to make some closing statements.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Jacob, for the in-depth presentation. As we know, there's a tremendous amount of concern around this project because of its enormity in terms of its size. But the whole idea of this type of project is to ensure that the public does have a more in-depth say in terms of how development moves forward in terms of a strategic way. That's why it's very important for you to be involved in this process. I know that Susan has indicated in the chat for everybody that they should send questions to info@visionmanorpark.ca. And these questions for the upcoming session next Monday will be distributed to my office along with the planners and the planning team. And we will spend a full 2 hours answering your questions on the basis of this presentation, as well as the information that is available on the Vision Manor Park website that outlines the plan. So it's very important for you to provide as much comment and questions as possible. I believe that this is a process that allows us to maximize community input into the way that we want to see community develop in a holistic way. And that is much better and is more advantageous than an existing kind of approach, which is basically, more of a Wild West approach where you're dealing with specific infill in specific places. This is a plan for the community and it requires a tremendous amount of input. So we would also like to remind you that you do have an active community association with the Manor Park Community Association, and they have been doing an excellent job in terms of providing information and advocacy on behalf of the community as well. So Also feel free to obviously link up with your community association, who's a strong voice. We have active conversations in my office, and I know that there has been also active conversations with the Agrawal family, with Manor Park Developments Management as well. So we want to ensure that this conversation continues and that there is definitely meaningful input. I also want to reiterate that I have not made a decision on this file. I am listening to your concerns. I am looking at the proposal. I'm going to take all those inputs into consideration. And the key here in terms of this process is ensuring that we have that discussion and that debate, which ideally informs the proposal that's before the city. So my expectation is that the plan will change. My expectation from listening to this presentation as well, from hearing from the developer, is that the plan will change based on the inputs. And so it will be very important for us to see that. And I think it's more productive for that to happen at this stage than obviously when it is before committee and council. I think that this is where the work happens. And so I really do encourage you to continue to be quite involved. Andrew, the Mcrae, the city planner, is absolutely correct. There was a tremendous amount of input that was provided to city planning staff, and we still invite you to continue to provide that input. So I'm very gratified that we've had over 160 people on this call. It shows the interest, and I do invite you back next Monday, June the 14th at 6:30 p.m. to participate on our question and answer period, which will also be simulcast live on Facebook. And just a reminder that once this presentation is completed, it will be archived on my Facebook page. So if you did not get a chance to watch the whole presentation, it will be there for you to review. So thank you so much for joining us this evening, and I will turn the session back to Susan.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you everyone again for joining us. So as a reminder, you can send your questions to info@visionmanorpark.ca. Veuillez envoyer vos questions à info@visionmanorpark.ca, mais nous répondre également aux questions en direct. We will also be taking questions live. I've got that question as well, Vincent. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Nous avons hâte de vous voir la semaine prochaine. Good night.